I didn't realize my children were slowly drifting away until the day I stopped setting an extra place at the table without thinking. For years, it had been a habit so natural I never questioned it. Even when I knew no one was coming over, I still found myself reaching for one more plate, one more glass, as if some part of me still expected the front door to open before dinner. But that evening, standing alone in my kitchen with my hand resting on the cabinet handle, I caught myself pausing in the silence. And for the first time, the silence felt less like peace, and more like absence. My name is Walter. I'm 73 years old, and I still live in the same house where my children grew up. It's a small brick house on a quiet street, nothing special if you were to drive by it. The shutters could use paint. The porch light flickers sometimes before settling. The maple tree in the front yard has grown so wide over the years that in summer it throws a shadow over nearly half the lawn. I planted that tree the year my daughter was born. It was barely taller than my knee back then. Now it stands higher than the roof, and every fall it scatters red and gold leaves across the yard like old photographs someone forgot to put away. When you live in one place long enough, the house stops feeling like wood and brick and drywall. It becomes memory in solid form. You don't just walk through rooms. You walk through years. The hallway still creaks in the same spot outside what used to be my son's room. The pantry door still sticks in damp weather, just like it did when my wife used to tug it open with one hand while holding a grocery list in the other. There are pencil marks on the inside of the laundry room door where we measured the children's height every birthday until they were too old, or too embarrassed, to keep doing it. Sometimes I stand there and look at those marks and think how strange it is that children spend years growing in front of you, so slowly you almost don't notice, and then one day they are gone from the house, and all that growing seems to have happened in a single afternoon. I have 2 children. My daughter, Elaine, is the older one. My son, Peter, is 3 years younger. They are both in their 40s now, which still sounds strange to me when I say it out loud. In my mind, part of them remains fixed at different ages. Elaine at 10, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor reading library books that were far too advanced for her age. Peter at 8, running through the backyard with grass-stained jeans and one shoelace untied, shouting about something he had discovered in the garage. Elaine was the calm one. Thoughtful. Careful with words. Even as a child, she observed more than she said. She noticed small things. The way rain sounded different on the windows in the kitchen than in the bedrooms, or how some people smiled politely without meaning it. She used to sit with my wife at the dining room table while cookies cooled on wax paper and ask questions that felt older than she was. Why do grown-ups stop talking to each other when they're angry? Why does Grandma always say she's fine when she looks sad? Things like that. Peter was different. Warmer in a louder way. Easier to read. When he was happy, the whole house knew it. When he was upset, the whole house knew that too. He built forts out of couch cushions, left baseball gloves in the hallway, forgot where he put everything except the things he wasn't supposed to touch. He once took apart our old toaster because he wanted to understand how it worked. He was 11 at the time. The toaster never recovered, but I remember trying not to laugh while pretending to be annoyed. Back then, our house had a rhythm to it. School mornings began with footsteps overhead, cabinet doors opening and closing, the smell of toast, coffee, and whatever cereal the children were currently demanding we buy. My wife, Margaret, always moved through the kitchen with calm purpose, one hand tying back her hair while the other packed lunches or signed school forms we had forgotten the night before. I left for work early most days, but not before sitting at the table with my coffee and listening to the little pieces of their lives spill into the room. Elaine worrying about a spelling test. Peter insisting he needed poster board that day and had definitely told us earlier, even though he absolutely had not. Margaret reminding them to eat something besides sugar. Those mornings felt ordinary at the time. In fact, if I was tired or in a hurry, they sometimes felt hectic. But I understand now that ordinary family life is one of those things you only recognize as precious after it has already passed. Evenings had their own rhythm too. Dinner together most nights. Not perfectly, not like a television family, but often enough that the dining table meant something in this house. Margaret believed in eating together. "It's the one time nobody should be rushing," she used to say, placing serving bowls on the table as if the act itself carried some kind of protection. So we ate together. We talked about school, work, neighbors, bills, whatever was happening. Peter interrupted too much. Elaine rolled her eyes at him. Margaret gave me a look when I let him get away with something I probably shouldn't have. Sometimes the conversations were silly. Sometimes serious. Sometimes one of the children stomped off in a mood. But even then, the table gathered us in a way that made the house feel anchored. On Saturdays, if the weather was good, I mowed the lawn while the children played outside. Elaine usually lasted about 20 minutes before wandering off with a book. Peter turned every yard chore into some kind of adventure. Raking leaves became mountain building. Washing the car became a water fight. One summer he was convinced we could build a tree house in the maple out front. I told him the branches weren't right for it. He spent 2 weeks drawing plans anyway. Margaret loved Christmas in a way I never quite managed to. I enjoyed it, of course, but she transformed the house. White lights around the front window. Cinnamon candles in the hallway. Music low in the background from Thanksgiving onward. Elaine helped decorate the tree carefully, branch by branch, as if each ornament had feelings. Peter dumped the boxes out on the rug and tried to hang 6 ornaments at eye level in the same spot. Every year we argued playfully about the star on top because he insisted on doing it long before he was tall enough. Those holidays felt endless when we were in them. School concerts, baking trays, wrapping paper, grandparents visiting, neighbors stopping by with tins of cookies. The house would be so full of noise and movement that by New Year's Day all I wanted was a little quiet. I got it, eventually. More than I ever wanted. The first real shift came when Elaine left for college. She chose a school about 3 hours away, close enough to drive, far enough that the house felt changed the minute she left. I remember carrying the last box up to her dorm room, setting it down on the narrow bed, and standing there with that helpless feeling parents get when they realize they are no longer the ones arranging the furniture of their child's life. The room smelled faintly of floor cleaner and fresh paint. Her new roommate hadn't arrived yet. Margaret fussed over the bedding. Elaine kept smiling in that tight way people do when they are excited and trying not to cry at the same time. On the drive home, Margaret was quiet for almost an hour. Then she said, "The house is going to feel strange tonight." She was right. It did. But Elaine called often in those early months. Sometimes just to talk while walking back from class. Sometimes because she was homesick and trying not to admit it directly. She would ask what we had for dinner, whether Peter was being impossible, whether the neighbor's dog still barked at nothing every night around 9. Those calls mattered more than I knew at the time. They made the distance feel temporary, manageable. Like she had not really gone anywhere, only expanded her orbit for a little while. Peter followed a few years later, though not in the same way. He stayed closer to home after high school, attended a local college, and moved into an apartment with a friend after his second year. By then the gradual emptying of the house had already begun, but his leaving still changed the air in it. One child gone feels like absence. 2 children gone feels like the house itself has exhaled and not taken another breath. Margaret handled it better than I did, at least on the surface. She adapted routines. Turned one bedroom into a sewing room for a while. Donated old coats the children had not worn in years. Bought less milk. Fewer apples. Smaller turkeys at Thanksgiving. I, on the other hand, kept expecting noise. I would hear the garage door from a neighbor's house and glance up, thinking Peter was stopping by. I would pass Elaine's room and instinctively lower the television, remembering she used to complain when it was too loud while she was studying. Habits outlive the people who created them. Still, those early years after they moved out were not unhappy. The children visited often enough. Holidays, of course, but also random Sundays, birthdays, the occasional midweek dinner if work schedules allowed. Margaret would text with Elaine. Peter called when he needed advice about cars, rent, taxes, anything adult life had thrown at him before he felt ready. The house did not feel full anymore, but it still felt connected. And then time did what it always does. It moved. Elaine got married first. Her husband, Nathan, was kind in the steady, understated way that wins you over gradually. Not a loud man, not polished, but thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke. Helped clear the dishes without being asked. Remembered details from previous conversations. Margaret liked him immediately, which in our family counted for a lot. They settled in a suburb about 45 minutes away. Close enough, I thought. Close enough for regular dinners. Close enough for easy closeness. Peter married a few years later. His wife, Anna, brought warmth with her. She laughed quickly, talked with her hands, and seemed to understand Peter's restless nature without being worn down by it. They moved farther than I expected, nearly 2 hours away because of work and housing prices and all the practical things that shape modern lives. At first, I still believed families stayed close if they wanted to. Geography mattered, of course, but not as much as intention. That was what I thought then. Maybe it is still true. Maybe the harder truth is that intention itself gets crowded. Margaret became ill before I fully understood how much else had changed. It began small. Fatigue. A cough that lingered. Appointments that led to more appointments. The kind of medical language that rearranges your life before you even realize it has entered the room. Illness changes time. Days become centered around medications, test results, waiting rooms, energy levels. The children came around more during that period. They called more often too. Elaine drove down after work just to sit with her mother and fold laundry while they talked. Peter handled practical things, yard work, pharmacy pickups, fixing the loose railing on the back steps. In those months, despite the fear and sadness of it all, I felt the family pull close again. Not in the old carefree way, but in a more serious one. A circle tightening in bad weather. After Margaret died, everything changed again. That sentence is simple, but the experience of it was not. The house became quieter in a way I had never known was possible. Not just because one more person was gone, but because she had been the center of so many invisible routines. The one who made coffee first. The one who answered birthday cards on time. The one who remembered whose child had a recital, whose dog was sick, who preferred dark meat over white at Thanksgiving. Family life had flowed through her in 100 quiet ways. When she was gone, the family remained, but the current changed. In the first year after her death, the children were attentive. They called. They visited. They checked whether I was eating properly, whether I was sleeping, whether I wanted to come stay with one of them for a while. I appreciated it, though I rarely said so with enough feeling. I was still learning how to speak inside grief, and grief is a poor translator. But over time, as grief softened around the edges and daily life resumed its demands, something else resumed too. Distance. Not intentional distance. That is important. Nothing in this story happened because my children were cruel or careless people. If anything, that would have been easier to understand. No, this was something subtler, and therefore harder to name. Their lives grew denser. Careers deepened. Children were born. Schedules multiplied. What had once been frequent contact became occasional. What had once been occasional became rare enough that I noticed it only after the pattern had fully formed. I saw it first in the calls. Elaine's phone conversations became shorter. She often called while driving between errands, or while stirring something on the stove, or in those exhausted 10-minute gaps before bedtime routines began in her house. She still loved me. I never doubted that. But love was increasingly being carried by hurried voices and interrupted sentences. Peter was different. He was never much of a phone man, even when younger, but after his second child was born his responses took on a familiar rhythm. Crazy week, Dad? Sorry, meant to call. I'll catch you this weekend. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. Months can be built out of good intentions that never quite become action. Then there were the visits. At first they skipped one Sunday here, one birthday lunch there. A child had a fever. Work was demanding. Travel, soccer. Plumbing trouble. Weather. You can build an entire wall of understandable reasons if you stack them carefully enough. I did that for years. I defended my children to myself with more loyalty than they would ever have asked for. But little truths do not vanish just because you explain them kindly. One Saturday in early spring, I found myself preparing for company without thinking. I had bought a roast 2 days earlier because some part of me still associated weekends with the possibility of family dropping in. I peeled carrots. Set out the good plates. Opened the curtains wide because Margaret always said the dining room looked friendlier with more light. At around 2 in the afternoon, while I was tying the string on the roast, I realized no one was coming. No plans had been made. No one had suggested they might stop by. The expectation had come entirely from me. I remember standing there with my hands damp from washing vegetables, feeling foolish in a way that stung more than I want to admit. Not because I had cooked too much. I could freeze leftovers. But because hope had become such a reflex that I no longer noticed it until it embarrassed me. That evening I ate alone at a table set for one, and tried not to make meaning out of it. Still, the meaning came. Not in one grand revelation. More like sediment collecting over time. An unanswered text. A visit postponed and never rescheduled. A holiday meal that ended earlier than it used to because the grandchildren had activities the next morning. The shift from, "We're thinking of stopping by," to, "We'll try to make it this month." A certain kind of listening you only develop in older age, when silence begins to say as much as words. One afternoon, a neighbor named Frank stopped me while I was bringing in the trash bins. Frank is younger than I am by maybe 10 years, but old enough to understand more than he says directly. We stood in the driveway talking about weather, property taxes, the usual things men talk about when they are really just keeping each other company for 5 minutes. Then he mentioned that his daughter and her family came by most Sundays for lunch. He said it casually, without any intention behind it, but I felt something inside me tighten. I smiled, nodded, said that sounded nice. And it did sound nice. I was not envious of him exactly. What I felt was more complicated. Something like recognition mixed with loss. The kind that does not announce itself as grief until much later. That night I walked through the house before bed the way I often do, turning off lights that do not need to be on because no one is coming behind me anymore. I passed the dining room. The extra chairs stood tucked neatly beneath the table. The sideboard held a framed photo from a Christmas years earlier, Margaret at the head of the table, Elaine laughing at something out of frame, Peter pretending not to notice he was being photographed. Everyone leaning slightly toward one another without thinking about it. I stood there a long time. Not because I was sad in the dramatic sense. Because I was beginning, slowly, to understand that the family we had once been now existed mainly in photographs, memories, and holiday schedules. And that understanding changed the temperature of the house. For a long time after that evening in the dining room, I tried not to think too much about what I had realized. It's strange how the mind works when it senses something uncomfortable. Instead of confronting the thought directly, it circles around it. It explains it away. It replaces it with practical reasons that sound reasonable enough to believe. People are busy. Children grow up. Life gets complicated. Those were the explanations I repeated to myself whenever the house felt a little too quiet. And most of the time, those explanations were probably true. But explanations don't always change how something feels. The following spring arrived slowly. The maple tree in the front yard began growing new leaves again, small and pale at first, then fuller and darker as the weeks passed. I've always liked that tree. I planted it the year Elaine was born. Margaret had laughed at the time and said it would take 20 years before it was big enough to make a difference in the yard. She was wrong. By the time Elaine turned 10, the branches were already wide enough for Peter to climb halfway up before we noticed. He fell once too. Nothing serious, just a scraped elbow and a bruised sense of pride. But I remember the way Margaret rushed outside barefoot, the way Peter tried to pretend he wasn't hurt because he didn't want to be told he couldn't climb the tree anymore. That memory came back to me one morning while I was trimming some branches that had grown too close to the house. I was standing on a small ladder with a pair of old garden shears, cutting away the thinner limbs when I heard children laughing somewhere down the street. Not my grandchildren. Just neighborhood kids playing. But the sound carried through the quiet air in a way that brought back the past so clearly it almost felt like time had folded in on itself. For a moment I could see Peter in the yard again, racing his bicycle down the driveway, skidding to a stop near the garage. Elaine sitting on the porch steps reading a book while pretending not to listen to whatever game he was inventing. Those memories appear like that sometimes. Without warning. One moment you're trimming branches or washing dishes, and the next moment you're standing in two different decades at once. Later that afternoon, I made myself a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table. It's the same table we've had for nearly 35 years. A solid oak thing Margaret insisted on buying even though it cost more than we planned to spend at the time. Tables matter, she told me. This is where families happen. I didn't fully understand what she meant back then. But she was right. Nearly every important conversation we ever had as a family happened at that table. School troubles. Job decisions. Engagement announcements. Holiday plans. Now the table is usually quiet. I still sit there for breakfast every morning. Coffee, toast, sometimes eggs if I feel ambitious. Sometimes I read the newspaper. Sometimes I just look out the window at the backyard. On that particular afternoon, while I was finishing my sandwich, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Elaine. Sorry I haven't called this week. Work has been crazy. Love you? I smiled when I read it. It was a kind message. But I noticed something as I stared at the screen for a moment longer. The message felt like a small bridge thrown across a very wide space. I typed back that everything was fine and that I hoped she wasn't working too hard. She sent a small heart emoji in response. And that was the end of the conversation. Years ago, that exchange would have turned into a 15-minute phone call. Now it ended in 3 messages. Again, I told myself that this was simply how life worked. People communicate differently now. Short messages instead of long conversations. Still, the house felt quiet again after the phone went still. That summer passed in much the same way. Occasional messages. A few short phone calls. Peter visited once in early July with his youngest daughter. She ran through the house with the kind of fearless energy that reminded me so much of Peter at that age that it made me laugh out loud. Children have a way of bringing life back into rooms that have grown used to silence. She found the basket of old board games in the living room closet and insisted we play something. Peter sat on the couch watching us with a tired smile, while she moved game pieces around with great seriousness. At one point she looked up at him and asked, "Did you play this when you were little?" Peter glanced around the room before answering. "Yeah," he said. "All the time." For a brief moment, I saw something pass across his face. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to nostalgia. The visit lasted about 2 hours. Then they had to leave because of a birthday party she was attending later that afternoon. After they drove away, the house felt noticeably quieter again. I walked through the rooms turning off lights that had been left on. The board game pieces were still scattered across the coffee table. I left them there until the next morning. Not because I forgot. Because for a few hours it made the house feel less empty. As the months passed, I noticed something else beginning to happen. The holidays, which once felt like natural gatherings, began to feel more like scheduled events. Christmas was still celebrated together. But the visits were shorter now. Elaine's family usually arrived mid-morning. Peter's sometime around noon. There were grandchildren running through the house, presents opened, food shared, laughter echoing through the living room. For a few hours, the house returned to something close to its old self. But by early evening people began checking the time. Long drives home. Early school mornings. Busy schedules. Gradually the coats were gathered. Hugs were exchanged. Cars started in the driveway. And within half an hour the house was quiet again. That first Christmas after I noticed this pattern, I sat in the living room long after everyone had gone home. The tree lights were still glowing softly in the corner. Wrapping paper had been gathered into bags. The plates had been washed and stacked. But the echo of voices still seemed to hang faintly in the air. It was then that I began to understand something more clearly. The family hadn't disappeared. But the center of it had moved. The lives of my children now revolved around their own homes, their own routines, their own families. The house where they grew up had become more like a place they visited occasionally. Not the place where life happened every day. I don't say that with bitterness. It's simply the truth. Still, there was one moment later that winter that made the realization feel even sharper. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had spent most of the morning doing small chores around the house: laundry, a bit of cleaning, organizing some old paperwork in the study. Around 2 o'clock I sat down in the living room with a cup of coffee. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching it. After a while, I noticed something unusual. I was waiting for something that I couldn't quite name. And then I realized what it was. For years, Sunday afternoons had been the time when one of the children might stop by. Not always, but often enough that the possibility lived quietly in the back of my mind. That afternoon, for the first time, I realized that I no longer expected it. The waiting had become a habit. But the expectation behind it had slowly faded. I looked around the living room for a long moment. The same couch. The same bookshelf. The same framed photographs along the wall. But the life that once moved through those spaces had continued forward somewhere else. And I understood something I hadn't fully admitted before. My children hadn't left me behind. They had simply continued walking down the road of their own lives. And I had remained here, standing in the doorway of the place where their lives had once begun. For a long time after that quiet Sunday afternoon, I tried not to dwell on what I had realized. Life, even when it becomes quieter, still has its routines. The days continued the way they always had. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper, watered the plants Margaret used to care for so carefully. I mowed the lawn when it needed mowing, shoveled snow in the winter, and fixed the little things around the house that seem to break more often as time passes. At first, those routines felt like a way to keep life steady. But gradually I began to notice something else about them. They had become solitary. Not lonely in a dramatic way. Just quieter. For decades, nearly every small task in this house had once been part of a shared rhythm. Margaret humming softly while folding laundry. Peter asking where the hammer was for the third time that afternoon. Elaine sitting at the table finishing homework while dinner cooked on the stove. Now those same tasks happened in silence. And silence has a way of making memories louder. One afternoon in early spring, I opened a closet in the hallway looking for a flashlight. Instead, I found an old cardboard box tucked behind some winter coats. The box was filled with things Margaret had saved over the years. School drawings, report cards, birthday cards written in crooked childhood handwriting. I sat on the floor in the hallway and began looking through them one by one. A crayon drawing Peter had made of our house when he was 6. The roof was bright red for some reason, and the family stood outside holding hands like stick figures. A folded piece of paper with Elaine's careful handwriting describing what she wanted to be when she grew up. A teacher or maybe a writer, she had written. I sat there for a long time going through those papers. At some point the afternoon light shifted through the hallway window, and I realized several hours had passed. The strange thing about those memories wasn't sadness. It was how alive they still felt. For a few moments, I could almost hear the sound of the house the way it used to be. Footsteps running down the stairs. Cabinet doors closing. Margaret calling everyone to dinner. When I finally put the papers back in the box, I noticed something written on the inside flap in Margaret's handwriting. Keep these. Someday they'll matter more than we realize. She had been right about so many things. That evening, I made myself dinner and sat at the kitchen table. For a long time after Margaret died, I avoided sitting in her chair. It felt wrong somehow. But over the years I stopped thinking about which seat had belonged to whom. The table is just a table now. Still, sometimes when I sit there with my coffee in the morning, I can almost picture the way the room used to look. Elaine reading while eating breakfast. Peter arguing that cereal counted as a balanced meal. Margaret shaking her head with that small smile she had when she knew chaos was about to begin. Time has a strange way of folding in on itself like that. Later that week, the phone rang just as I was finishing dinner. I looked at the screen and saw Peter's name. When I answered, I could hear noise in the background, children talking, a television somewhere in the house. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice sounded tired but warm. We talked for a while about ordinary things. His work had been busy. One of the kids had started soccer. The other was learning to read. Every now and then I could hear one of them shouting something across the room. It reminded me so much of the way our house used to sound that I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest. Before we hung up, Peter said something that surprised me. "You should come visit sometime, Dad." I told him I would think about it. After the call ended, I sat in the living room for a long time. The house was quiet again. But the quiet felt slightly different. Because for the first time in a while, I understood something I had been missing. For years I had been standing in this house waiting for life to return to the way it used to be. Waiting for visits that happened less often. Waiting for phone calls that came when schedules allowed. Waiting for the noise of family to fill the rooms again. But the truth was something much simpler. Life hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved forward. The center of it now existed in other houses. Other kitchens. Other living rooms filled with the sound of grandchildren playing and people moving through busy evenings. My children hadn't meant to drift away. They had simply continued building the lives they once dreamed about while sitting at this very table. And that was something Margaret had always understood better than I did. Children don't stay. They grow. They leave. They build homes of their own. And the love between parents and children doesn't disappear when that happens. It simply stretches. Sometimes farther than we expected. But still connected. The following weekend, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I got in the car and drove to visit Peter. It felt strange at first, driving away from the house instead of waiting in it. But when I arrived, the front door opened before I even knocked. My granddaughter ran down the hallway and wrapped her arms around my legs. Peter appeared behind her with the same half-smile he had when he was a teenager. The house was noisy. Toys scattered across the floor. Something cooking in the kitchen. Voices overlapping in conversation. For a moment I simply stood there taking it in. Not because it reminded me of the past. But because it reminded me that life was still moving. Just in different places. That evening, when I returned to my own house, the quiet felt familiar again. But it no longer felt empty. Because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Children don't slowly drift away because they stop loving their parents. They drift because life pulls them forward. Into responsibilities. Into families. Into worlds that grow larger than the one they started in. And perhaps the quiet truth of growing older is learning that love doesn't always stay close enough to hear every day. But it remains there all the same. Sometimes in phone calls. Sometimes in holiday visits. Sometimes in the simple knowledge that somewhere, in another house filled with laughter, the life you helped build is continuing. And when I sit here in the evening now, listening to the wind move through the branches of the old maple tree outside, I don't think about the distance the way I once did. Instead, I think about the years when the house was full. The laughter. The noise. The ordinary moments that once felt so routine. And I remind myself of something simple. My children may have slowly drifted away from this house. But they never truly drifted away from my life.